Fantastic. Thank you for accommodating the technical difficulties. I'm really incredibly grateful to be here. My name is Benjamin Life, and I I'm not currently in the Cascadia bioregion. My home is on the Front Range of Colorado, and I'm here today speaking from the position of the work that I do in an organization that I helped co-found called Open Civics, which is a civic innovation consortium and also an applied innovation network for local stewards. And the reason that I'm here is because of my deep admiration and appreciation for what all of you are up to, and my sense that this is a movement that is planetary in nature, and that this group of people assembled here on this call are, as Joe said earlier, some of the most important leaders doing this work. And because I come from a kind of meso or meta layer of this movement, I'm tracking multiple bioregions that are engaging in this bioregional formation process. And so I want to speak today from that perspective, not just from what's happening here locally, but how what's happening here in Cascadia is a template for other bioregions around the world. And the contribution that Open Civics wants to make to this movement is to really think through the larger implications of thinking about governance from a bioregional perspective, and the downstream implications of the bioregional frame in how we think about our economies and our social structures. And so much of this comes from the work of Vandana Shiva. And so I want to open with a quote from Vandana, who says, "Living democracy grows like a tree from the bottom up." And so much of my own thinking about bioregional governance comes from the work of Vandana Shiva and what she calls earth democracy. And this is a fundamental paradigm shift in how we think about citizenship and the role of governance in society. As I'm sure most of you are very acutely aware, our current systems of governance are based around the idea of the nation state. And the nation state has really come to mean what it means today through the process of settler colonialism. And so the borders and the purpose of our current institutions of government are not oriented towards the vitality of place. They're not oriented towards communities that nourish and sustain life. They're much more interested in military industrial complex and economic extraction and protecting the rights of capital. And so reimagining what democracy would be from the perspective of what Vandana Shiva calls earth democracy, we arrive at the notion of bioregional congresses, where instead of the purpose of the governance institution being to protect and defend the rights of capital, we start to see our communities as interconnected and interpenetrating wholes or holons that are in relationship with each other and part of a larger whole. And so a governance institution with this kind of mandate would be, its purpose would be to steward the vitality of place. And this all really clicked in for me when Joe Brewer came to my house here in Boulder, and he laid out for me the design pathway for regenerating Earth, which, if you haven't read that book, I really highly recommend it. And I just had chills throughout my entire body for about 20 minutes. It was like, this is a pathway that actually seems viable, that it's a journey that we can take together to go from where we are now in this extractive and fragile, collapsing civilization into one that we actually want to live in. And the phrase that really stood out to me in that dinner that we had was the phrase, "a planetary federation of bioregional congresses." And just that phrase alone contains an entire worldview inside of it. The phrase planetary, meaning that our planet is actually a whole organism. The Gaian organism is a living being of which we are all a part. The word federation, meaning instead of a kind of one world government that is top down and has centralized authority, the authority of a planetary governance system would come from the bottom up. It would be opt-in and consent-based through the autonomous and participatory choice of the subcomponents opting into that larger frame of a planetary Congress. And then bioregional congresses. This audience is, of course, very familiar with what a bioregion is, but to imagine a governance body informed by bioregional boundaries implies so many downstream effects around how our society and how our economy are organized. And so I want to go into some of the details around what I think a bioregional Congress might be. And so it would be inherently grassroots and place-based, highly relational and contextual, and based in ecological stewardship. And this is deeply informed by Indigenous leadership and Indigenous cosmovision, which we have a tremendous amount to learn from, and also an opportunity to heal some of the historical injustices that have happened through colonization as we kind of reweave the fabric of humanity back together. And this is a form of cosmolocalism. Because at the cosmic level, we have this universal principle of localization, that this can become a rallying cry for our movement, because despite how unique and bespoke each local context is, there is a kind of a universal mandate to relocalize, to bring our attention back to the local, and to start thinking about our economy, about our institutions, about our education system from this local perspective. And these institutions would need to be interoperable with each other, and they would need to be holonic. And this way of seeing the world breaks down nation-state borders. I had such an incredible experience in the San Juan Islands and on the Canadian side of the border, on Vancouver Island, seeing how much in common there was between these different islands on the side of this arbitrary border, and that we can begin to reorient towards our embedded relationships within ecology by forming these new types of institutions that help us to return to more kinship-based relationships that defy the logic of national identities. And these new institutions are based in commons governance, of a participatory commons. And so instead of a regulatory state that is trying to impose control from the top down, these kinds of institutions would be based in aligning incentives for common stewardship and regenerative action. And this makes bioregional governance less of an institution and more of an extitution. An institution is about capture and enclosure. An extitution is more about aligning behaviors and identities within a commons and within a participatory commons. And so we're in effect doing the Buckminster Fuller quote that many of you may have heard. We're not fighting the old system, we're merely innovating to make the old one obsolete. And I think this is very important because there are many movements that are trying to create change from within the legacy institutions. And I think we've reached a point of collapse and capture in which these legacy institutions are crumbling from the inside. And so in some ways, it's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It's time for us to take this power back into our own hands and reestablish what governance means from this shift in worldview. And we don't need to go inside of these legacy institutions to do so, although we can collaborate with them about. And so once we begin to see the world through this holonic lens, I think it's important for us as a movement building tactic to begin to identify a shared language and taxonomy that helps us to speak in the language of bioregions. And I really love this framework from One Earth, which is where this image comes from, which may not be perfect, but it gives us at least a way of talking about the different components of bioregions, so that we can utilize that taxonomy to build atop of, so that what's happening here in Cascadia can better interface with what's happening here on the Front Range or in Mexico or in Hawaii. And so the taxonomy that they've come up with utilizes the language of realms. Realms are mostly continental boundaries, and they're composed of subrealms, which include multiple watersheds. And then within watersheds, we have multiple bioregions. And within bioregions, we have multiple ecoregions. And then we have ecotones, which are the liminal, the edge cases between bioregions. And I think if we can align around this language together, it will help it grow this movement and help us to interoperate better with other bioregional movements around the world. And I also want to introduce these other two frameworks. The first one is from Joanna Macy, which is a framework around the Great Turning, the three processes that are part of the transition from an industrial growth society to a life-sustaining society. And the one that I think most people focus on, or at least historically have focused on, are holding actions. This is traditional activism. We're trying to hold back the destructive ecocidal effects of capitalism. And these are important, but they're not the whole picture. And we have shifts in consciousness, which I think gatherings like this are such a beautiful example of how by gathering together, we're actually anchoring in and establishing a worldview that more and more of us are shifting our awareness to think in this way. And that is part of movement building. And then the third, which is where I want to spend most of my time focusing in this presentation, is structural change. I think this is maybe one of the most underdeveloped areas of the Great Turning, because I believe that we won't get to the planetary positive tipping points that we want to see as a movement until we have frameworks and institutions that are touching the ground and formalizing this worldview into the world and instantiating it in a powerful way. And then the second framework on the right side of the screen, which you also might be familiar with, is the Three Horizons framework. And that red line, H1, the first horizon, represents business as usual, which is basically just the internal logic of capitalism. It knows how to extract and commodify very well, and it will continue to operate in that mode even as it begins to destroy itself, and its fittedness is declining. So we're already seeing that decline and that collapse happening. And then the second horizon, H2, the blue line, is our transition, our intermediary approaches to renewable energy or regenerative finance. These are mechanisms that don't fundamentally address the systemic failures of our current epoch, but they give us a little bit of breathing room. And so I think a lot of times our attention goes to that horizon because these are easier to achieve than the kind of deep structural transformations that need to happen. And so it's easier to feel like we've got to win by doing these things. And these are important. They help us ease the process of transition. But then the third horizon is a viable future. And this is the horizon that I think people like Joe are we need people like Joe to help us keep our awareness and our attention on what is that longer arc? Where are we actually trying to go together as a species? And that's the area that I think bioregional governance can really contribute towards. And the bioregional movement is this early seed of that third horizon. And so as we're thinking about developing the capacities to really create the structural change that's needed for this movement to come into form, I'm focused on these areas of design consideration. First, I think we certainly need education, and there are so many people on this call already engaged in this type of work. We need education both in how to organize And I think the pro-social framework is an incredible example of this, and I'm so grateful to be part of that community. And then we also need traditional ecological knowledge of the bioregion. And the way that I see education is as a feedback loop, and that what we need, in addition to local materials for education, local curricula, we also need to create a peer learning federation where the insights that are being developed as we're working on the ground to bring about this movement can be shared and federated, so that the best practices that are emerging through the application of this theory of change can begin to form a feedback loop where it'll get easier and easier as we learn together how to bring about this process. And that brings me to the next kind of public utility that we really need as a movement, which is mechanisms for coordination. How do we make decisions together? How do we pool resources together? How do we make sure that we can communicate appropriately across networks, vast groups of people, groups of groups? And that also relates to currency and finance. We have so many amazing tools to fund regenerative action, to create community currencies and mutual credit systems. I think that one of the major contributions that bioregional economies can play is reducing the amount of extraction and capture from the bioregion and helping to create more closed loop economies where we're able to be more resilient and meet more of our needs locally. And we can do that with systems like mutual credit, which there are already amazing tools out there to do. And some people on this call are actually developing those tools. And then we need to think about interoperability. How does the formation process of one bioregional body integrate and communicate both in the vertical holonic dimension? How do we nest bioregions within watersheds? And how do we have peer-to-peer communications across bioregions? And having a set of interoperable infrastructures that facilitate that process will be necessary both at a technological and at a social level, and also in the language that we use. And so that brings me to this idea of holonic relationships. How do we define a watershed or a bioregion? How do we create direct democracy relationships so that we can have representatives from our bioregion that sit on a watershed council, for example? And then a particular form of education that we need is the education around how do we form these bioregional bodies? How do we make it easier for people who are having these awakening experiences of these shifts in consciousness and give them the tools that they need to bring the best of what's already happened here in this community into their bioregion? And then lastly, we need frameworks for open data and regenerative praxis. These are best practices in how do we build soil? How do we restore watersheds? And how do we ensure that the data that we're gathering around soil health and water health can be shared with other bioregional groups? One example of this would be if my bioregion is measuring water quality in our local streams and rivers, how do we have an open data standard where we're able to share that water quality information with other bioregions that might be upstream or downstream, so that we can identify if there's a pathogen in the water stream, where is that pathogen being introduced, so that we can better collaborate to remove it from the watershed? And this really brings me to the role of blockchain and peer-to-peer technology. I think what we're effectively trying to do here is we're trying to create the nervous system of the planet. And while we have a really strong need to focus locally on the intimate relationships that we have with land and the people that live in our bioregion, I think we also would be remiss to not include the best of the technology that we have available to us to facilitate that process. And ideally, this technology kind of fades into the background, but it can be an incredibly powerful tool as we begin to grow this movement. And why I think technology and peer-to-peer technology are the right frame for bioregional technology is that they enable permissionless coordination. This means we don't need a central body to approve the process that we're engaged in, and keep relationships with each other that don't rely on a centralized authority. And while we are not trying to take down the old legacy system, we do need to be aware that there are incentives baked into that system that if we start to threaten the bottom line of big multinational corporations, they do have a lot of power that they could exert on our movement. And so we need to be building technology that can't be captured, can't be shut off if we become a threat to those legacy institutions. And that enable us to have a degree of sovereignty around the technology that we're creating. And blockchain in particular allows us to create shared funding pools, which I think is really important for any commons-based approach to funding and coordination, which allows us to have democratic, self-governed, and transparent allocation of resources. So let's say we're trying to engage in a community education initiative or a watershed cleanup initiative. We can collectively pool our resources into a common pool without needing to create a new bank account or a new institution. And we can then vote together on how we want to allocate those resources. And that's an incredibly powerful aspect of blockchain technology. And then we're able to have a ledger that is able to show over time who did we pay out resources to, and it helps create a greater degree of transparency and trust that the people that we're allocating resources to are following through on the actions that we are paying them to take. However, these technologies don't come without limitations. And so I want to be very clear and direct about what those limitations are. Blockchain in particular was designed to be a trustless system where I don't need to know anything about you in order to engage with you because of the nature of how blockchains work and how they validate our interactions. But I think as a movement, we actually want to be creating local, place-based, high-trust relationships where I know your mom, I know your kids, and we have a higher degree of trust. And so I think it's going to be important that we not rely on the trustlessness of the system, but still design these systems in a way that promote direct, peer, trust-based relationships. Another big issue of blockchains is they can create abstraction and over financialization, where everything becomes a financial transaction, when actually we want to be living more in the gift economy. I do, at least. And so we want to make sure that these technologies don't become the focalization of what we're doing, but just become tools that fade into the background. And then also we have issues with accessibility. It's very difficult for some people to engage with these systems because it's a new technology, and so it's going to require a degree of onboarding and education and handholding and facilitation in order to make sure that everyone in our bioregion is able to utilize these tools that we're creating or using. And so that's kind of an overview of how I am thinking about the design process. And the organization that I'm a part of, Open Civics, is here to facilitate the development of open source tools and multi-stakeholder collaboration in service of this movement. And so Open Civics is an open network. So even if you're not building technology or building collaboration mechanisms, we still want to include you as a member of the network because we feel that there's a peer learning process in how these tools are applied and how they're developed. They shouldn't be developed in a vacuum. They should be developed with peers on the ground who are utilizing them so that we can make sure that we're not just building tools for their own sake, but we're actually engaged in a participatory design process. And then we also are a consortium, which is a formal process of collaboration between peers who are developing these kinds of innovations. And we use the term civic innovation. And civic to me is about mutual aid and care. Our civic domain has been utterly ravaged by capitalism and extraction, and everything has been centralized and commodified. And so the civic space is a space that needs to be renewed. It's the space that is the space in between all of us, where we actually show up and care for each other. And the original meaning of the word civics comes from an act of service, that for no reason other than our profound care for one another, we show up and we offer our gifts in service of the whole. And so we utilize these three principles of civic innovation to make sure that we're oriented towards ethical systemic adaptation. And so those three principles are resilience, vitality, and choice. Resilience is the state and capacity for adaptive self-organization sufficient to provide core life support function across changing world circumstances. This is primarily to do with localization. How can we ensure that most of our core needs are met locally and that we have redundancy in the system? So if one part of the system fails, we can still support human life across these changing world circumstances, especially as climate chaos becomes more and more extreme. We're going to need to look at our food sheds, our energy systems, food and housing from this highly localized perspective. But that in and of itself is insufficient. And that's why we have the principle of vitality, which is to do with ecological regeneration. It's life's capacity to create more life. It's also deeply informed by an indigenous cosmology that our sense of well-being, our personal well-being, is actually completely interconnected with our community well-being and our ecological well-being, that we actually can't separate those things and that they're deeply interconnected. And then our last principle is choice, which is the state of fundamental respect for the sovereign agency of all beings, not just human beings, and the capacity of those individual agents to express their agency and influence their circumstances. This is the principle that ensures that we're not going down in a kind of eco-fascist perspective, where we actually believe that if people have the attunement and the care of these other principles of vitality and resilience, that there's a higher degree of trust that we can place in human agency. That once we realize that through interbeing, we are actually all completely interconnected, then we want to design systems that allow people to opt in and be in a state of choice in how they participate. And the reason why I believe that Web3, which is another term for blockchain technology, is a big part of this story, and maybe you are not as familiar with this world because it is such a niche, and it can sometimes get a bad rap, particularly because Bitcoin is associated with so much energy consumption, and that was kind of the main critique of Bitcoin. But if you could just withhold judgment for a moment, I do believe that Bitcoin as a principle is incredibly important for the evolution of humanity. So this is an evolutionary journey of how Web3 came to be. And what Bitcoin did was it demonstrated that instead of a corrupt, centralized institution responsible for issuing our money, and if you've studied monetary theory, you know that so much of our extractive, ecocidal current dynamic comes from the way in which money is created. And so what Bitcoin demonstrated is that we could actually utilize a protocol to issue money that had different incentives baked into it than the way that money is currently issued. And that was a major innovation. And I think it's no accident that shortly after that, Occupy Wall Street happened. And I believe that Occupy was distinct as a social movement because it really brought our awareness instead of to a particular form of injustice, the way in which injustice was actually baked into the system of our extractive capitalist worldview. And then following along from there, we can see how Web3 evolved to become a substrate for systemic adaptation and innovation that was really about putting back into the hands of the people the way in which our systems are designed. And so instead of relying on massive multinational or elites to decide what our systems are, it put back into our hands the capacity to create and launch new systems that we could opt into. And so when you take Web3, which is this substrate for systemic innovation, and you have civics, which is our systems of care and mutual aid, and innovation, this evolutionary adaptive process, together that becomes what we call decentralized civics. And so decentralized civics is a process or a methodology for creating these interoperable open source civic utilities. These are the kind of public utilities that I believe will be essential for the formation of bioregional economies and bioregional governance. And these are also a form of public goods. Public goods are non-rivalrous and non-enclosable, which means that anyone can use them, and my use of them doesn't diminish your ability to use them. And lot of this is in the realm of open source software, because I can just copy paste and I can send you a tool that it costs me almost nothing to send you the tool. And then the value that that creates for you and your community can be exponential. And this is also true of education. Once we've developed curricula with just a few bytes of information across the internet, I can empower someone with new tools that they need to steward their local communities with knowledge and with open source technology. And so I believe philosophy of public goods is really essential to thinking through how we create these tools that empower the bioregional movement. And the way that Open Civics does this is through the process of collaborative initiatives. And so collaborative initiatives are multi-stakeholder and inter-organizational collaborations for mutual benefit and for a larger systemic impact. For example, if members of this group want to participate in our bioregional governance collaborative initiative, you'll get to meet stakeholders from other bioregions who are thinking through the same design problems, who are approaching this from a very similar intent. And together, by pooling our energy and our capacities together, we'll be able to have a much larger impact than we could if we're just working in silos on our own. And the way that we do this is through a collaborative protocol, which begins with aligning around a systemic strategy. We can look at what are the leverage points, what are the key trim tabs, to use another Buckminster Fuller phrase, that will enable this system to pivot from the way that it is now into the future state that we all collectively envision. And so it's partially a pro-social envisioning process of how do we describe the future system that we want to participate in. And then how do we make funding allocations to different organizations? And this is where non-rivalry is very important, because we're not trying to compete for grant funding. We're trying to say, in this blue sky infinite possibility, what are the funding allocations that are actually necessary in order for us to do this systems change work together? And then let's go out and work with philanthropists and institutions to raise those funds. And then we have indicators of our performance that help us to understand how well are we doing and how can we learn over time to do better to improve the systemic impact that we're making. And so some of the initial examples that Open Civics is working on as collaborative initiatives are citizen assemblies, a governance toolkit or SDK, bioregional governance, which is what I'm speaking about today, food shed sovereignty networks, which I think is a major part of bioregionalism, but we're working on as its own collaborative initiative, but I think they'll work very well together, and our quadratic funding grants program. So we're giving away $25,000 to projects that are working on open source or collaborative frameworks that can support this movement. And so I'll share a link at the end. I would love to encourage anyone on this call who is interested in creating educational curriculum or anything that we can share more broadly with the public in how to organize bioregionally. I would love to encourage you to apply for a grant, and hopefully we can get a few $1,000s to your organization or to you personally to be able to engage in this work. And Open Civics comes from this call to action of responsibility, to realize that there is no external authority that we can rely on that's going to come in and save the day. It's actually up to us as citizens, as people who care for each other and for this planet, to take action. And as Joe said, we only have a very limited period of time before the collapse scenarios that we all see coming become so intense. And so we have this limited window to begin to create the lifeboats that will help us transition from that extractive world into this world that we know in our hearts is possible. And so Open Civics is really an invitation for collaboration, realizing that we can't do it on our own, and that there is a more beautiful world that's moving through each of us, that we are all on this journey collectively. We're not in silos. Those silos are actually illusions that we can begin to break down as we realize that we're actually all in this together. And so my invitation to this community would be to participate in the collaborative initiative that we're running around bioregional governance, and to bring your own creativity. If there's something that you want to bring into a process of collaborative research and creating these materials that we can share out with the world that will help this process take place, I would really love to encourage you to apply for membership and apply for a grant from our grants program. we're here to serve this movement. I realize that everything that I've said, so many other people know so much more about it than I do. And my intent here is to really just plant a flag of collaboration, of a desire to create interoperability between different bioregions. And I would love to do that work with all of you. Thank you. And I would love to open up for questions. And then my thought was, maybe we can do 5 or 10 minutes of questions and answers if people want to ask specific questions about what I've shared. And then I would love to maybe use 10 minutes in a fishbowl kind of council around, what are the questions that are living in us around how to link what's happening here with this planetary bioregional movement that is already underway. Yeah, over to you, Melanie.
There we go. I'm walking around here with my phone. It's so weird not to have my image here. Let's figure out how to actually see you all. Benjamin, thank you so much for this conversation, and the governance piece feels so absolutely critical, and especially for having opened up the possibility for funding. I'm interested to know more. What's the source of your funding? Where are you actually getting your inputs from? That also feels like a rich place for us to be considering in regenerative financing. And federal and state grants can be a horse and pony show and just very difficult. So I'm interested in that aspect of things. There I am.
Yeah,
Hi.
This is where hi.
Hi.
It's a fantastic question, and there is a lot happening in the regenerative finance world right now around mechanisms for funding regeneration. And unfortunately, the carbon credit market has really been the main focus. And I think most people here understand why carbon credits are not effective, because they create the wrong kind of incentive where we're just thinking in this single dimension. And we're not thinking about the ecosystem services that are actually the foundation of healthy ecologies. And so, we can get funding for planting trees or not cutting down trees, there are new mechanisms for funding ecosystem services that are just coming online right now. And I think actually Pete Cork was at the Vancouver Island event that you all hosted. And I'm working with that group, which is called Quaxala, which is working with the British Columbian government. And the British Columbian government just unlocked $1 billion for ecosystem services. And those funds need a place to go. And so I think the more that we can create these participatory commons-based institutions, I think those are the kinds of bodies that would be most equitable to allocate those resources to. In terms of our grants program, the initial grant that we got was from a civic innovation project that's very much in the Web3 world, that's focused on advocacy and campaigning for decentralized organizations. And they are helping us to bridge the gap where we're trying to go from a purely technological world and actually help that technology world find a home that's actually connected to ecology and connected to place-based organizations. And so we're trying to play that bridging role between the world of cryptocurrency and the world of actually like on the ground regenerative action. Claire.
Answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was amazing. I just wanted to add in it at the UBCM, which is the Union of BC Municipalities, they've also just passed policy legislation to support the biodiversity piece. And I'm trying to find the piece of policy that they've just passed, but it also adds into supporting this. So that's for British Columbia.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. Over to you, Sherry.
Hello, wonderful. It's been great to be here this morning. And Benjamin, that was awesome. I really felt like it was like this coalescing and coherence taking place in the entire field that we've been talking since this morning and over these last weeks and years and decades. So it really felt like kind of like a level of coherence for the larger whole that I think to have it be made visible and kind of articulated so well gives us a sort of an inner knowing of like, oh yeah, it's all coming together. Oh yeah, we have those pieces. Oh, there's enough embodiment. Oh, we have pro-social capacities. Because without pro-social capacities, we don't get very far. And so just brilliant. The one thing I wanted to ask, of lots of things to talk more about, but I think this is the point, is you started with bioregional congresses. And as you know, I have a passion around, dialogue and group process and facilitation and going deeper and harvesting. And I really would love to see what you think of as, given what Joe shared at the beginning about why this bioregion on the planet now is so critical, and we are the people, and we're getting everything we need and need to know and not know, and we need spaces to come together. So what does a Cascadian Congress actually look like to put into action a lot of the things that we've been talking about?
That's a fantastic question. I don't claim to know the answer exactly to it, but the first thing that comes to mind is that that first pro-social principle that comes from Eleanor Ostrom is around shared identity. And I think that's what Cascadia has so much more than other bioregions. Here on the Front Range, I don't know many people who have a Front Range identity, who see themselves as part of that bioregion. And so I think that's one of the main things that Cascadia can demonstrate is this is actually a new way of seeing ourselves as Cascadians. That's a big starting point to build that initial solidarity. And then the other thing that comes to mind is part of the reason why I like the framework from One Earth is it allows us to get slightly more granular. Like I think what Joe really initiated me into when he shared the design pathway for regenerating Earth is that the bioregional scale is the necessary and appropriate scale to begin organizing because of the effects of we can't actually do true regeneration at anything less than a bioregional scale. However, when it comes to small group dialogue, which is I think where what you're saying is there's so much to be gained from that, the intimacy that happens from like direct conversations. I think it would be really helpful as we're forming these bioregional congresses to look at what are the subunits, how can we localize even more while still holding the bioregional frame, and how can we, by convening at the island scale or the neighborhood scale, yet still link what we're doing to that larger conversation. And I think if we had a kind of a template of organizing principles of here's how to organize this scale of people, and here's how that scale of people might relate to this larger scale of a Congress. Having that as a kind of template or educational curricula, I think would be where I would want to start in that process.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to say one more thing and then pass it over to Howard. I really appreciate your kind of extrapolation there. And I also want to plant a seed for some funding for actually a convening at the bioregional level, really well done and organized, that actually can kind of take a lot of what we've been talking about over the last 5 weeks and in our movement and in all these different aspects to the next level and make it more visible, because we're just at the tip of that iceberg, and there's a kind of an essentiality to kind of convening, taking what Regenerate Cascadia has done, and now like this is a Zoom kind of open space, and then do it in person and just do a really great, and do it sooner than later, like 3-4 months kind of thing. And I think there's funding for that to activate a lot of what we're talking about here.
That would be great. And I would love to see you or anyone else make a grant application to fund that in our grant round. That would be a great use of those funds. Over to you, Howard.
Well, thank you, Benjamin. I much appreciate your presentation. Wanted to get your take on the Regen Network and the work they've been doing, which is very much along the lines that your presentation informed us about, and just wanted to see how you regarded their work, whether you see them as allies or if their model departs in significant ways from the directions you're advocating.
Yeah, I have I love Gregory, I love Austin. They're two really incredible human beings. And I was with both of them at Climate Week in New York City a few weeks ago. And Austin gave an amazing presentation on how we can use this technology to weave into the rights of nature and to have basically forests that own themselves, watersheds that own themselves, and to have mechanisms where they can actually have voting rights in these new types of institutions, where their vote might be actually contingent upon data that's being gathered from open source sensors and integrated into the process of making decisions, so that we could say we actually can't make a decision unless we have the buy-in from the river. And that, to me, that gave me chills just thinking about it just now. Like, that is such a beyond horizon of something that I think would change the game dynamics of how we make decisions as human beings, where we're actually including the totality of the more than human world in the way that we make decisions. And that's, to me, what governance is. It's coordination and decision making around the commons. And so I think Regen Network and their approach to the credits that they're providing, I think, is very aligned, because they're interested in biodiversity, and they're just beginning to launch biodiversity credits. And at the same time, Gregory Landua, when I talked to him about bioregional governance, he was like, "Oh, we tried that. Like, we already did that. It doesn't work. It's not gonna happen." And I'm the kind of person where I'm going to keep following spirit. I'm going to keep following the guidance of the planet. And I just take that as like a kind of a warning sign from an elder who's been doing this for a little bit longer than I have, that like, there's some challenges here that you're going to need to work through. And that's partially why I think that working on food systems is such a powerful onboarding mechanism for bioregionalism, because there's already a market there. There's already a direct need, and we don't need to get people to understand what being is and how we are nature, in order to care about having healthy food that's locally sourced. And so I think that working at the food shed level could actually be a mechanism by which we get more and more people into the bioregional culture. So those are my thoughts relative to Regen Network. I love all those guys.
I should have made this disclosure that Culture and Carbon Trust is part of a Regen Foundation endowment, spelled ENDAO, using their distributed autonomous organization model. And I wouldn't take too personally Gregory's strong opinion. I think he has strong opinions for and about most everything.
Great. I would love to learn more about your work, Howard, and thank you for the question. Yeah. Over to you, Ben.
There we go. Yeah, this is really exciting. I'm loving the direction that it's going.
I'm sorry, oh, here we go. Sorry, I couldn't hear the first part of your question. There was a technical glitch. Would you mind just starting over?
But basically, I was just praising the presentation. I think these are great ideas, and I'm very excited about this direction. And especially, I think one of the things, building on Sherry's comment about how do we actually, work at scales, and I think the holographic aspect, and the KPIs, the idea that there's some sort of feedback loop that is built in. I think that's also could be a really powerful mechanism where we're setting up little experiments, like we're treating everything as experiments, where there's and we're checking in, and kind of adopting that agile development framework as well, that everything that we do is prototyping, and that is this working the way we think it should work? And just prompting those questions: how should it work? How would we know? What's it look like if it's working? is a really great framework for, for moving those conversations forward, and also for engaging new people as they come in. Because there's always a new, the next experiment, the next project becomes a new entree point for people. But I think in terms of those feedback loops, whatever the economy is, it has to be based, it has to decommodify the land and see the land as the source of, the source of all resource, right? That, and so I think your comment about trying to figure out how to bridge that gap between blockchain technology and some of these regen finance schemes and like actual land is really key, because moving forward, if we're going to have a productive economy, we need to have an economic base, and ultimately the land is the base. So, I think we need to make sure that we don't lose in the abstraction of the blockchain that kind of direct connection with land.
100%. Yeah, I think that's one of the main potential pitfalls of utilizing technology in this way, is that it becomes the focalization. And I also think, I think there were some comments in the chat around how the cryptocurrency world has already been completely enclosed and extracted from. And I want to believe that there's still some potential there, because it really just is a tool, and it makes sense that capitalism encloses and captures any new innovation to try to utilize it for the ends of capitalism. But I think that with this worldview intact, and us using more of an indigenous cosmology to inform how we're applying the technology, that's what most inspires me. And to your point about experimentation and iteration and bringing different stakeholder groups together, I was actually up in Portland for a blockchain summit, a localization blockchain summit, if you can believe it, that exists in Portland. And I met with Christina Bowen, who is not here on the call today. I was just looking for her name, but she was at one of the Regenerate Cascadia events, and she's based in the Gorge. And her platform is called Social Roots, and it's a pro-social technology platform that is all about networks of networks and groups of groups. I would love to see this community begin to be one of the early beta testers of that tool, because it's a great way to integrate different networks together, and it makes communication so much easier, because we're all on so many communications channels. No one wants to be on a new communications channel, a new Telegram group, a new WhatsApp, a new Discord. But in the conversation that I was having with her, we were diving into systems mapping. And she's been doing systems mapping professionally for the last 15 years. But the challenge that she's found is that no one's utilizing these maps. You spend 6 months developing a very complex map of how the system operates, and then there's no follow through, because there's not a systems aware tactical strategy that's being deployed. And I think that's one of the things that we need to do, and where the iterative feedback process is helping us to better understand, because systems are so complex, as we take one action, we actually can't know what all of the effects are going to be of that action. We can guess, but we really need to be sensing and in this deeply intimate, like, listening, in order to understand what the impacts that we're having are. And then as we're bringing new stakeholders into our collaborative processes, how do we integrate their perspectives and their on-the-ground awareness of the systems that they're embedded in? Because we can't just have an eagle-eye view. We need to have this bottom-up grassroots view, where there might be specific challenges that are happening in specific areas that we're not aware of until those stakeholders have a voice in our collaborative process. And that's why we want to take this open collaborative approach, where as new stakeholders come in, we're listening to them. We're integrating what their on-the-ground awareness is into our systems aware strategy. And yeah, thank you for your question. And I had wanted to do some fish bowling, but I love that as a frame. Maybe we'll get another chance to do a fish bowl around this process. And I would love to host all of you in maybe a kind of fishbowl council around this larger process. And just want to repeat the invitation to collaborate. When I first met Brandon and Claire, y'all were very knee deep in bringing this tour to life. And so it was probably an inappropriate time to be like, hey, let's collaborate. Let's do this larger bioregional planetary thing. And I just so respect and appreciate the focalization that you've had and the care and the love that you've brought to your bioregion. And I just want to reiterate that I'm really a servant of life. I'm really here to serve this movement. And the role that I see myself playing is holding this layer of how do these different bioregional movements relate to each other, and how can we set up the infrastructure so that we can be engaged in that learning process together, because I really see it as a planetary movement. And when I close my eyes and I imagine like the future that I want my children and grandchildren to live in, it's a future in which the institutions that exist in service of life. And that is a prayer that goes out across the entire planet for all children and all families, that they get to know a world in which every form of interaction of our economy and of our governance is in service of life. And that's what I'm in service to. So please submit an application to become a member if you want to be part of this collaborative process. I would be so honored to have each of you as part of that process. And I just want to keep the dialogue flowing between what we're doing at the kind of organizational collaboration level and everything that's happening on the ground, and just make sure those streams of communication are open, so we can keep this dialogue going and keep this movement moving into that planetary coherence of the Gaian superorganism coming to know itself.
Ben, before we lose you, can you share the link to the woman doing the systems mapping? A few people have asked, and she sounds amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I would be happy to do that. And she also recommended me, she's going to start doing a course around systems mapping. And I'll share also the books that she recommended, Frijaf Capra and Jeremy Lent. I'll share those books as well. Those are great resources in addition to her platform as well, which I will also put in the chat.
So much, Benjamin. And yeah, just chiming in about Christina Bowen, who's here in the Mid-Columbia region, and we'll be doing, as I think many of the other areas, are going to be hosting monthly kind of meetups within our sort of watershed or activation group clusters. So excited for that, and thanks so much for your presentation and work, and looking forward to the way it keeps weaving. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.